continue to read DALIO's book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail. And this is chapter 5, The Big Cycle of Internal Order and Disorder. How people are with each other is the primary driver of the outcomes they get. Within countries, there are systems for orders for governing how people are supposed to behave with each other. These systems and the actual behaviors of people operating within them produce consequences. In this chapter, we will explore the timeless and universal cause-effect relationships that shape the internal orders and the behaviors that drive the shifts between periods of order and periods of disorder. The biggest thing affecting most people in most countries through time is how people struggle to make, take, and distribute wealth and power. Though they also struggle over other things, most importantly, ideology and religion. I saw how this struggle happened in timeless and universal ways, and how these struggles had huge implications for all aspects of a people's lives, starting with what happened with taxes and economy, and how people were with each other through periods of boom and bust and peace and war, and how they unfolded in cyclical ways, like the tide coming in and out. The 6 stages of the internal cycle. Internal orders typically change through a relatively standard sequence of stages, like the progression of a disease. As with cancer, it is best to stop the progress before getting into the later stages. Stage 1, when a new order begins and the new leadership consolidates power. Stage 2, when the resource allocation system and the government bureaucracies are built and refined. Stage 3, when there is peace and prosperity. Stage 4, when there are great excesses in spending and diet and the widening of wealth and the political gaps. Stage 5, when there are very bad financial conditions and intense conflict. Stage 6, when there are civil wars or revolutions and so on. And then back to stage 1. Every country is not going through them, and many of them are in different stages. For example, China and India are in a very different stages than the United States and most European countries. Which stages countries are in versus other countries affects the relations between the countries and is the primary determinant of the world order. We will explore all of them in the last chapter of this book. The cycle's archetypical evolution transpires as shown, as we know, it's like a bell shape. First stage, then rise, then top, then decline, and then revolution. These cycles have taken place for as long as there have been recorded history. So many cycles are linked together, and they are upward sloping because of evolutionary gains that are made over time. And DALIO presented some diagrams about China's absolute powers and figurative big cycles going back around the year 600 and so on. Since different countries are typically in different stages of the cycle, and since they take wealth and global political power from each other, some countries are rising while others are declining, so the whole is less volatile than any one country. Diving into the 6 stages of the cycle. Stage 1, when a new order begins and the new leadership consolidates power. To fight a civil war or to have a revolution, even a peaceful one, is to have a great conflict in which one side wins and the other side loses, and the country suffers damages. Stage 1 is what follows the war. It is the time when the winner gains control and the losers must submit. While the winners were strong enough to win, at this first stage of the new order, they must also be wise enough to consolidate power and rebuild the country. After winning the power, the new leaders typically mop up the remaining opposition and fight among themselves for power. In fact, one might say that revolutions typically come in two parts. The first part is the fight to bring down the established leaders and the systems, and the second part is the fight to remove those who were loyal to the former leaders and the fight for power among those who won. I will call the second part purges and touch on them in this section. But the detail we don't need to know. During this stage, the leaders who do best are consolidators of power. I have to comment here is that maybe this is indeed true for most of the countries, where the leaders that win will actually kill or purge the other leaders. But the severity varies from one country to the other. In America, at least from the very beginning, George Washington, after 8 years as president, gave where the election, we had a new president, Adams, and then Jefferson, etc. It wasn't like this as DALIO described. In a sense, that's the system America has built for herself. It may be not so for other countries. I know that DALIO may say United States is no exception, although the severity is not that big as compared to other countries. But we will see, because here I have just read part of it. I shouldn't jump to conclusion. So we will continue. Stage 2, when resource allocation systems and government bureaucracies are built and refined. I call this phase early prosperity because it is typically the beginning of a peaceful and prosperous period. To be successful, the system has to produce prosperity for most people, especially the large middle class. The leaders who are best during this stage are typically very different from those who succeeded in stage 6 and 1. I call them civil engineers. Well, they need to be smart, and ideally they are still strong and inspirational. Above all else, they need to be able to design and build a system that is productive for most people. Oh, they need to have people working for them who can do that. Here I want to make a comment. Even within a system, for example, after Deng Xiaoping came to power, indeed, he gave the managerial job to some of the more civil engineers type of leaders, even after him, for some years. So will be interesting to see how the new leader will build his cycle. The most extraordinary leaders are those who took their countries through stage 6, 1, and 2. That is, through the Civil War revolution, through the consolidation of power, and through the building of the institutions and the systems that worked fabulously for a long time after them and did it at a skill. Stage 3, when there is a peace and a prosperity. I also call this phase mid-prosperity. It is the sweet spot of the internal order cycle. It is when people have abundance of opportunity to be productive, excited about, work well together, produce a lot, get rich, and admired for being successful. This is a time for the inspirational visionary who can imagine and convey the exciting picture of a future that never existed before. B, actually build the future out. And then C, use the prosperity earned to broaden the inclusiveness of it and to invest in the future. They do this while D, maintaining sound finances, and E, pursuing excellent international relations, so that they protect or expand their empires without any financially or socially debilitating wars. During this stage, the developments to pay attention to that reflect the big risks that naturally develop and undermine the self-sustaining good results are the widening of the opportunity, income, wealth, and values gaps, accompanied by bad and unfair conditions for the majority, luxurious and unfairly privileged positions for the elites, declining productivity, and bad finances in which excess debts are created. The great empires and the great dynasties that were also able to sustain themselves staged in stage 3 by avoiding these risks. Stage 4, a period of excesses. I also call this the bubble prosperity phase. During this phase, the archetypical best leader is the well-grounded, disciplined leader who understands and conveys sound fundamental behaviors that yield productivity and sound finances and creates restraints when the crowd wants to overdo things. These leaders are the ones who lead the country to continue to reinvest a significant amount of their earnings and their time into being productive when they become richer. As mentioned, Li Guangyao probably is the best example. He ensured that his country and fellow citizens had the culture to become well-educated, disciplined, and of a strong character, even after becoming successful and rich. Stage 5, when there are bad financial conditions and intense conflict. The classic toxic mix. The classic toxic mix of forces that brings about big internal conflicts consists of number 1, the country and the people in the country being in bad financial shape. Number 2, large income, wealth, and values gaps within that entity. And 3, a severe negative economic shock. A classic marker of being in stage 5 and a leading indicator of the loss of borrowing and spending power, which is one of the triggers for going into stage 6, is that the government has a large deficits that are creating more debt to be sold than buyers other than the government's own central bank are willing to buy. That leading indicator is turned on when governments that can't print money have to raise taxes and cut spending, or when those that can print money print a lot of it and buy a lot of government debt. And here, my comment is that indeed, for a country like USA, the America first is very important for the system to continue to prosper or sustain itself. Because if it is not for American first, then how can America save other or lead other or take profit from other people? Because gradually the U.S. will fall behind in this trend. America indeed has a lot of debts, and it seems that it is in somehow close to this stage. For other countries, because they are at this different stages, for example, China is at a different stage, so what they need is different from what the U.S. So that's the point I want to make here. Those places, cities, states, and countries that have the largest wealth gaps and the largest debts and the worst declines in incomes are most likely to have the greatest conflicts. Facing these conditions, expenditures have to be cut or more money has to be raised in some way. The next question becomes who will pay to fix them, the haves or the have-nots? Obviously, it cannot be the have-nots. But when the haves realize that they will be taxed to pay for debt service and to reduce the deficits, they typically leave, causing the hollowing out process. And here I want to make a comment for a country to keep the haves so that they won't leave. The country must provide some other things that are superior to other countries, so that the rich people will feel that there are no other better places, or at least in the long run, there are no other better places. What are these superior things? Then, of course, it depends on the country, what they can offer. Okay, let's continue. History shows that raising taxes and cutting spending when there are large wealth gaps and bad economic conditions, more than anything else, has been a leading indicator of civil wars or revolutions of the same type. Averages don't matter as much as the number of people who are suffering and their power. That's also true because especially in the US, one person, one vote. It doesn't matter what their income level is. So the average wealth don't matter. Averages don't matter, but the number of people does matter. To have peace and prosperity, a society must have a productivity that benefits most people. An essential ingredient for success is that the debt and the money that are created are used to produce productivity gains and favorable returns on investment, rather than just being given away without yielding productivity and income gains. If it is given away without yielding these gains, the money will be devalued to the point that it won't leave the government or anyone else with much buying power. A comment here is that indeed the US, when they give the money to the poor, welfare, etc., it won't work. Although they produce some kind of a stable living environment for the poor, so in that sense it does contribute to some productivity, but overall that part is quite small. But what kind of giving distribution is proper? That requires more thinking. Okay. Next, history shows that lending and spending on items that produce broad-based productivity gains and returns on investment that exceeded the borrowing costs result in living standards rising with debts being paid off. So these are good policies. That's true. If you have in Chinese, you have a one stone to kill two birds. That is, on one hand, you can raise the productivity. On the other hand, you can also reduce the debts. Of course, that's important. That's good. But what are these things? We have to think. But indeed, DALIO here said something useful. When we think about the policies, then we have to think about this. Now, the stage decadence. What a society spends money on matters. When it spends on investment items that yield productivity and income gains, it makes for a better future than when it spends on consumption items that don't raise productivity and income. The next stage, bureaucracy. While early in the internal order cycle, bureaucracy is low, it is high late in the cycle, which makes sensible and needed decision making more difficult. Next stage is populism and extremism. After the disorder and discontent come leaders who have strong personalities, are anti-elitist, and claim to fight for the common man. They are called populists. Populism is a political and social phenomenon that appeals to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are not being addressed by the elites. It typically develops when there are wealth and opportunity gaps, perceived cultural threats from those with different values both inside and outside the country, and establishment elites in positions of power who are not working effectively for most people. Watch populism and polarization as markers. The more that populism and polarization exist, the further along a nation is in stage 5, and the closer it is to civil war and revolution. In stage 5, moderates become the minority. In stage 6, they cease to exist. A comment here is that people may think after reading this, will say, oh, we don't like populism, or we don't like polarization, so we should choose the moderates. However, cycle being a cycle, it is natural. If one person does not do populism, another one will do. So it is inevitable. Even you choose moderates, number one, the moderates may not be elected. Second, the moderates cannot solve the problem. You cannot hide the problem. The problem is there. The next substage is class warfare. In stage 5, class warfare intensifies. That is because, as a rule, during times of increased hardship and conflict, there is an increased inclination to look at people in stereotypical ways as members of one or more classes, and to look at these classes as being enemies or allies. A class marker in stage 5 that increases in stage 6 is the demonization for those in other classes, which typically produces one or more scapegoat classes who are commonly believed to be the sources of the problem. This leads to the drive to exclude, imprison, or destroy them, which happens in stage 6. For example, Jews in Nazis' time, Chinese minorities living in non-Chinese countries. In the UK, Catholics were demonized. The next stage, substage, the loss of truth in the public domain. Not knowing what is true because of distortions in the media and the propaganda increases, as people become more polarized, emotional and political motivated. In stage 5, those who are fighting typically work with those in the media to manipulate people's emotions to gain support and to destroy the opposition. It is well recognized this is happening at the time of this writing. The perceived truth in media, both traditional and social, is lower than at any other time in our lifetimes. For example, a 2019 Gallup poll found that only 13% of Americans surveyed have a great deal of trust in the media, and only 41% of those surveyed have either a fair or great deal of trust in the media. That compares with 72% who trusted the media in 1976. Even very capable and powerful people are now too afraid of the media to speak up about important matters or run for public office. Next substage, rule-following phase and raw fighting begins, when the causes that the people are passionately behind are more important to them than the system for making decisions. The system is in jeopardy. Rules and laws work only when they are critical clear, and most people value working within them enough that they are willing to compromise in order to make them work well. When winning becomes the only thing that matters, unethical fighting becomes progressively more forceful in self-reinforcing ways. When everyone has causes that they are fighting for and no one can agree on anything, the system is on the brink of civil war or revolution. Late in stage 5, it is common for the legal and the police systems to be used as political weapons by those who can control them. Also, private policy systems form, for example, thugs who beat people up and take their assets, and the bodyguards to protect people from these things happening to them. Later in stage 5, there are an increasing number of protests that become increasingly violent. People dying in the fighting is the marker that almost certainly signifies the progression to the next and more violent civil war stage, which will continue until the winners and losers are clearly determined. When in doubt, get out. If you don't want to be in a civil war or a war, you should get out while the getting is good. This is typically late in stage 5. History has shown that when things are bad, the doors typically close for people who want to leave. The same is true for investments and money as countries introduce capital controls and other measures during such times. Well, that's true. However, which country or where to go? That's a difficult question. Crossing the line from stage 5, when there are very bad financial conditions and intense internal and external conflict exist, to stage 6, when there is a civil war, occurs when the system for resolving disagreements goes from working to not working. When one is in stage 5, like the US is now, the biggest question is how much the system will bend before it breaks. The biggest risk to democracies is that they produce such fragmented and antagonistic decision-making that they can be ineffective, which leads to bad results, which leads to revolutions led by populist autocrats who represent large segments of the population who want to have a strong, capable leader get control of the chaos and make the country work well for them. Different stages require different types of leaders to get the best results. Stage 5 is a juncture in which one path could lead to a civil war, revolution, and the other could lead to peaceful and ideally prosperous coexistence. There are a few such cases in history. We prefer them. Stage 6, when there are civil wars. Civil wars inevitably happen, so rather than assuming it won't happen here, which most people in most countries assume after an extended period of not having them, it is better to be wary of them and look for the markers to indicate how close one is. Though there are innumerable examples that I could have examined to understand how they work, I choose what I believe are the 29 most significant ones, which are shown in a table below. I categorized this group into those that produce big changes to the system regime and those who that did not. And I don't want to repeat here. They are the historical events. And it's very long to discuss them. Civil wars and revolutions inevitably take place to radically change the internal order. They include total restructurings of wealth and political power that include complete restructuring of debt and financial ownership and political decision-making. The periods of civil war are typically very brutal. How civil wars and revolutions transpire? Well, most of the archetypical civil wars and revolutions shifted power from the right to the left. Many shifted wealth and power to the right and away from those on the left. What does that mean? Let me repeat it again. Well, most of the archetypical civil wars and revolutions shifted power from the right to the left. Many shifted wealth and power to the right and away from those on the left. Let me continue to see what he means. However, there were fewer of them and they were different. They typically happened when the existing orders slipped into dysfunction, anarchies, and a large percentage of the population yearned for strong leadership, discipline, and productivity. Examples of revolutions from the left to the right include Germany, Spain, Japan, and Italy in the 1930s, the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1980s to the early 1990s. What does that mean? That I don't understand. The 1976 coup in Argentina, replacing Isabel Perón with a military junta, and the coup leading to the Second French Empire in 1851. Well, I still don't quite understand why DALIO said many shifted wealth and power to the right and away from those on the left. Anyway, let's continue. Typically, the people who led the Civil War revolution were well-educated people from middle-class backgrounds. These leaders also typically were charismatic and able to lead and work well with others to build big, well-run organizations that have the power to bring about the revolutions. If you want to look for the revolutionaries of the future, you might keep an eye on those who have these qualities. Over time, they typically evolve from being idealistic intellectuals wanting to change the system to be fairer to brutal revolutionaries bent on winning at all costs. Well, having large wealth gaps during the economically difficult times was typically the biggest source of conflict. There were always other reasons for conflict that added up to a lot of opposition to the leadership and the system. As previously mentioned, during the Civil War revolution stage of the cycle, the government in power almost always had an acute shortage of money, credit, and buying power. The shortage created a desire to grab money from those who had it, which led those who had wealth to move it into places and assets that were safe. which led the governments to stop these movements by imposing capital controls, that is, controls on movements to other jurisdictions, to other currencies, or to assets that are more difficult to tax and less productive, for example, gold. To make matters even worse, when there was internal disorder, foreign enemies were more likely to challenge the country. Almost all civil wars have had some foreign powers participating in an attempt to influence the outcome to their benefit. The beginning of civil wars and revolutions aren't clear when they are happening, though they are obvious when one is deeply in the middle of them. As for what types of leaders are best for civil wars and revolutions, they are the inspirational generals, people who are strong enough to marshal support and win the various types of battles they have to win. Because the fight is brutal, they have to be brutal enough to do whatever is necessary to win. While civil wars and revolutions are typically extremely painful, they often lead to restructurings that, if done well, can establish the foundation for improved future results. What the future after the Civil War revolutions look like depends on how the next steps are handled. Okay, that's the basic part of this chapter.